Chapter 7. Amos Perkins had provided some valuable information. Head west for 3 more days, and then turn southward now seemed appropriate for a new plan. I hoped to stay just west of settlement while heading south and eventually arriving in the first English colonies of Virginia. The leaders of our community had often criticized Virginians for their rumored lack of focus on religion. With the new supplies Amos provided, it would be possible to avoid people for a while. Over the next several years, the fact that plans seldom worked out would become apparent. 3 days later, life took a path I could have never imagined. Settlement had become so sparse that travel during the daylight was now possible. However, because the insects were so bad, I kept moving until the temperature dropped overnight and slept through the morning. The 3rd day after being beaten at the settlement, I awoke to a dull soreness still engulfing the welts on my scabbed back. I had determined a goal for the day of obtaining fresh meat. After carefully loading the flintlock rifle, I treaded slowly through the early morning forest. Dew glistened off many leaves in the bright morning sunlight. Just before camping the evening before, there had been a stream with numerous tracks left by game along the banks. I decided to follow the south-flowing stream for signs of game. After walking less than a mile, suddenly, sounds burst from the forest to my left. Something was coming toward me, and it was coming fast. I aimed my rifle toward the oncoming threat and glanced into the sunbeam-streaked forest. What happened next took place very quickly. Bursting through the brush 15 yards away were 3 Indians. A young male in front was bloodied and beaten. The 2 behind, flanked to each side of the apparent captive, were older and done up in full war paint. The 2 older ones, warriors, looked ferocious and angry as they each carried a tomahawk grasped in their hand at the ready. The young captive saw me first, and the fear in his eyes quickly changed to something else. It seemed to change to a look of hope, or maybe relief. The thought of fleeing leaped into my mind first, but there was no time. The older Indian on the right spotted me next. Instinctively and luckily, I dropped my body slightly to steady the rifle just as an unseen tomahawk sailed by just inches above my ear. It came so close the brown hair on my head actually shifted, and there was a brief buzzing sound in my ear as it rotated past. Shock over the nearly deadly blow caused me to freeze for a few long seconds before regaining focus. As the tomahawk thrower closed to within 3 steps of me, the rifle erupted in my hands. A hole tore open in the area of his stomach, and blood began to trickle slowly from the wound. The warrior's legs collapsed first as he dropped briefly to his knees before he dropped face first to the forest floor. As he fell, our eyes locked, and the look of anger and invincibility from seconds before was replaced by a look of disbelief. The young Indian had initially lunged to the left to avoid the fray. The second warrior stood with a look of confusion a few steps behind the first. Blood was now flowing from a wound on his shoulder. As he struggled to stay balanced, before I could even move, the young Indian captive lunged at him with the first warrior's tomahawk that had nearly brained me moments before in hand. The tomahawk split his forehead as it connected with a sickening thud. The young one tried to pry the embedded weapon from the dead man's skull, but failed. Lightning fast, he moved forward and grabbed the second warrior's tomahawk from his now lifeless hand before he stopped abruptly. He was only 3 steps away, regarding me curiously. Looking down, he knelt near the head of the first warrior. He put his hand to the warrior's mouth and hesitated. Slowly, he lifted his head, and we locked eyes again. Then he smiled. He slid the tomahawk into his braided leather belt and held his hands up in the air in a gesture like surrender. He then approached me cautiously and patted my shoulder before helping me up. He was speaking Indian words that I could not understand, but he seemed excited and friendly. He wore only a leather necklace with beads on his upper body. On his lower half he wore a blackened leather breechcloth with a bear painted on the front. His hair and eyes were very dark brown, and his skin was darkly tanned. He had some cuts on his arms and face and a swollen lower lip, but clearly by his movements, moments earlier, was otherwise uninjured. He was a handsome fellow. He then began to replay the scene using a form of sign language. He held up his hands as if holding a pretend gun and made a noise like he was firing. He then made a sign with his right hand to indicate something was tumbling down, followed by the same sign with his left hand. It was then I realized in the forest with what I had always been told were savages, this young Indian was telling me a story I understood. Out of complete luck, I managed to shoot both of those warriors with one shot. The musket ball had passed right through the first warrior's stomach and hit the second Indian in the shoulder. I would later learn that Guhipago, Lone Wolf, a Wyandotte Indian, had been captured while hunting by a Mohawk war party. He had been traveling with them for many days, and they were taking him back to their village, where he would likely have been traded or kept as a slave. Lone Wolf would become a close friend, and the Wyandotte Indians my new family.